Passover was one supper, one evening. That's it. They were to buy a lamb on Lamb Selection Day, which was the Sunday Jesus entered into Jerusalem. They were to keep it penned up 4 days and then slaughter it on Thursday before sundown, which was the 14th Nisan. Then they were to eat it after sundown, which was the 15th Nisan. And Jesus died on the 15th Nisan. Their day began at sunset. So right after sunset, their new day began. So they ate the lamb after sunset, and later that morning at 9 o'clock, the third hour of the day, Jesus was put on the cross. He died at the 9th hour at 3 p.m. But later in Jewish history, the term Passover began to encompass an 8-day celebration. You kick it off with the Paschal Supper, the 14th Nisan, then the 15th through the 21st is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They are two distinct feasts, but the term became a general term encompassing the totality of those two feasts. So Jesus died after they ate the Passover. Jesus died on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. All right? Then he arose on the first fruits, the Feast of First Fruits. So there was the Paschal Supper, then the first day of Unleavened Bread, which is always, now the Paschal Supper is always on a full moon, always. And then the Feast of Unleavened Bread always began the following Sabbath. So if the full moon was on a Thursday, the Friday, then that next day, Saturday, would be the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. If the full moon were on that Sabbath, then they'd have to wait another week to begin the Feast of Unleavened Bread on that following Sabbath. They always had to start on a Sabbath. So when Jesus died, was raised from the dead, that was the Feast of First Fruits, which can be called Pentecost. Now, it's not the 7th-day feast later on, but it was the feast in which the harvest of all grain started growing, and the Jews were to offer the very first of that harvest on the day of first fruits. That was the resurrection. So as they offered the first fruits to God, here we have the Son of God being raised from the dead as the first fruits to God. So the Paschal Supper, as you entered into a room where the Paschal Supper was going to take place, that was called a triclinium, Triclinium, triclinium. The table that was set up in that banquet room was called a triclinium, Triclinium. So the triclinium was in the triclinium. Are you with me on that? The table had an I, the room had an E. So if you are studying, doing research on any aspect of the supper, you're going to see two different spellings. They are not misspellings at all. One is the room, the other is the table. So now, the table around which I meant to bring my Old Testament, so someone's going to have to do my reading for me. The table which they sat around was called the triclinium. Notice the I, a horseshoe-shaped table with very short legs. When I say horseshoe, I mean in the similar shape. It was square. They had two tables like this, and then that table. They didn't have round like a real horseshoe. The table was about 6 inches off the ground, okay? About 6 inches off the ground. The account of this Paschal Supper is found in John 13 and Matthew 26. The participants reclined, leaning on their left elbow. Now, this absolutely was an example of my brain going out of gear. I should not have put this clause in, which were on the table. Their elbows were not on the table. How you explain that? I have no explanation other than my brain just quit working. All right, so the participants reclined, leaning on their left elbows, and they were on the floor because the table was 6 inches high, with the feet stretched out toward the wall behind them, so straight out from the table where they were sitting. We know Jesus sat in the second seat. So as you enter the room, let's say this is the banquet room, and here we have a big table coming this way, then a table going this way, and another table going this way. As you come into the room, the seating arrangement began at the farthest table from the entrance. So it would be from that entrance to this table over here. Now, we know that Jesus sat in the second seat. How do we know that? So here is the beginning of the end of the table. Here's the first place, all right? Not really seats. They had little cushions they laid on. Here's the second seat. The host always sat in the second seat. This was the way it was done in Judaism. Always sat in the second seat, all right? And I have plenty of sources to back all this up. John sat in the first seat. So here is John, the very first seat. You would think, well, Jesus ought to be sitting here. No, the host sat here. How do we know John sat in the first seat? Because John 13:25 says he leaned on Jesus' breast. Now, if they're all on their left elbow, which direction is their chest facing? Right. And if John leaned on Jesus' breast, he had to be in the first seat. We know Judas sat in the third seat, for he dipped in the same sop as Jesus did, Matthew 26:23, because no more than 3 could dip in the same bowl. That's how we know who sat in the first 3 seats. The host always had his most important person sit in the right seat, and his next important person sit in the left, to his left. That shows you what Jesus thought of Judas, the very man who sent him to the cross. The very man. Jesus didn't harbor any ill feelings. Now remember, it was at this supper that Satan entered into Judas, okay? It was at this supper. Prior to that, Judas was a good old boy. Satan may have been working with him, but we are specifically told that as they were preparing for the Paschal Supper, Satan entered into him. There was only 1 cup passed at this supper. As I've told you before, I dealt with a 1-cupper preacher in Indiana. We corresponded back and forth several times. He strongly believed that, he contended there's only 1 cup at the Lord's Supper. That was 1 vessel of wine that Jesus passed. When he passed that vessel, the apostles poured into their individual cups. They didn't all drink out of that 1 cup. And I posed many questions to him, such as, what if somebody had a fever or was somewhat sick and they came to services and he said, I don't think God would allow that. Now, how academic response is that? How many of you have shown up when you were somewhat sick, on the low end of the scale? The next day, it was pretty pronounced. You didn't know you were that sick when you showed up. And anyway, if a congregation wants to partake of 1 cup, may they do that? Yes. What's the problem? Wherein is the problem? Binding it on other people. binding it on other people. So there was one cup, and it was passed 4 times. The first cup, Jesus fills the cup with wine. Now, someone read Exodus 6, verses 6 and 7 before we go any further.
Therefore say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens.
1, okay.
Bring you out from the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rescue you from bondage, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm
3,
and with great judgments. I will take you as my people,
4,
and I will be your God. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brings you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians.
Okay, thank you, Lord. The first cup, Jesus fills the cup with wine, and he passes it. Now, before he does, I don't have this down. He offers a little prayer to his heavenly Father. He passes that receptacle down to the apostles, and then reiterates the very first promise in Exodus 6:6. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. Then someone, one of the apostles, offers a prayer of thanksgiving. Then the second cup is filled, and Jesus passes it and reiterates the second promise that Carl just read. I will rid you out of their bondage. Then more prayers are offered, after which someone reads Psalm 113 and 114. These were the first 2 psalms of what they call the Hallel. Hallel is the Hebrew word which means praise. These were praise psalms, Psalm 113 through 118. But they only read part of these. So when you, at some leisure time this week, it would be interesting for you to read the Hallel Psalm, Psalm 113 through 118, and you will know exactly what was read at the Paschal Suppers every year. The third cup is filled, and Jesus passes it and reiterates the third promise. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. Then there follows a prayer. It is at this juncture, catch this, at this juncture that Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is instituted in the middle of the Paschal Supper. It is not at the end, it is in the middle. Now, as I have written down here, the third cup was called the cup of blessing. Turn to 1 Corinthians 10:16. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not a communion of the blood of Christ? Paul says the cup of blessing, that's exactly what the third cup was called in the Paschal Supper. That's where he got the phrase, cup of blessing, from the Jewish practice of the Paschal Supper. Then the fourth cup is filled, and Jesus passes it and reiterates the fourth promise, I will take you to me for a people, and I will be to you a God. So Jesus took all 4 of these Old Testament promises in Exodus, and he reiterated, he brought them to light in the lives of the apostles to show that God's promises are still true. Notice this. I will rid you out of their bondage. I missed the first one. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rid you out of their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. I will take you to me for a people, and I will be to you a God. What's he doing? Is he not promising the apostles the very same thing that he promised the Jews, the Israelites, the Hebrews? The very same thing. He's promising that to us today. He will take us to him for a people, and he will be to us our God. Then there follows a reading of Psalm 115 through 118. Then the reading, notice, of Psalm 136. And then everybody sings or chants Psalm 115 through 118. Following the conclusion of the Paschal Supper, everyone, that is all the Jews in Jerusalem, went to the temple and they sang or they chanted Psalm 118 through 121. That was the Paschal Supper. And they did this every year. They still do it today in Israel. All right, do you have any questions? Today and next Sunday are going to be my last to teach and on the life of Christ, so I'm going to have to kind of scoot on. You don't have any questions? Would some of you help me pass these out, or would you pass them out for me? Oh, Jared, thank you. Appreciate it. I guess I better take one, Jared. Thank you. I'm still having to pass over some information. As long as we've been on the life of Christ, there's still information that, you'd need a 2-year class study to do justice to it. So I'm going to try to cover this information today and give you new information next Sunday. All right. Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives. He goes to Gethsemane, which is not a garden. Now, my wife, there are 2 or 3 different things that I've researched from Jewish sources. I never study what Gentiles say Jews believe. I take my information on Jewish culture strictly from Jewish professors, rabbis, or sages like Gamaliel. Thank you very much. So this is not secondhand information. This is exactly what the Jews themselves practiced and do for the most part even today. Gethsemane was what? As we studied last week, the last 2 weeks. It means olive press. There were gardens near it, all right? But it was not the garden because, and I've got all these scriptures on the lessons I passed out. When Jesus and his apostles went to Mount of Olives, to Gethsemane, which is only mentioned in Matthew and Mark 2 times, never is it related to a garden or called a garden. They went to Gethsemane, and Jesus, what did he do with Peter, James, and John with respect to the other 8? All right. He takes Peter, James, and John from Gethsemane. He leaves the 8 at Gethsemane. He goes yonder to pray, future tense in the Greek. Yonder to pray. That's when he goes to the garden. He takes Peter, James, and John, and he sets them as sentinels around the edge of the garden to watch for the coming mob. He goes further into the interior of the garden, and that's where he prays. He comes back 3 times, finds them sleeping. 2 times it exasperates him. The 3rd time he says, sleep on. Why does that exasperate him? Why is he ticked off? That's what we're getting into here. So why was Jesus so upset with his disciples when he found them sleeping after he had placed them as sentinels around the garden? They were to watch. That's exactly what they're told in Matthew 26:38. Tarry ye here and watch. The italicized word is emphasized by me only. And watch with me. This was the night of watching, the night when they were to stay awake. And yet they couldn't stay awake even for an hour. That's why he was upset with them when he went back and found them sleeping. Exodus 12:42 reads, now remember, in Exodus 12, the Israelites have their Paschal supper. They slaughter it, they roast it, they eat it. And then before midnight, Pharaoh says, you can leave my country in the early hours after midnight. They all are leaving Egypt. So verse 42 says, it is a night to be much observed unto the Lord for bringing them out from the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Lord to be observed of all the children of Israel in their generations. Guess what the Jews call that night? The night of watching. That's what they call the night of watching. To this day, every Israelite except young children stay awake all night long on the 15th Nisan. Why? As God watched over them, they are to stay up and focus their hearts on what God has done for His people. How He delivered them, how He protected them through the wilderness, and how He is going to do the same thing for them today. The night of watching. And all Jesus asked them to do was to watch for about 1 hour. And they couldn't even do that. That was a slap in His face. And that's what ticked Him off. Crucifixion. The following were reasons that led to our Lord's crucifixion. And these are specifically mentioned in these scriptures. Number one, He healed on the Sabbath. Only those Jews of the school of Shammai strongly opposed healing on the Sabbath, and not those of Hillel. Remember again, Hillel and Shammai were second century rabbis from Babylon, and they were sages. No one ever questioned what a rabbi said. No one. They took all this. Now, on Mount Sinai, the Jews contend that God gave Moses 2 laws, one written, one oral. The written law we read in the Old Testament. The oral law is called the tradition of the elders in the New Testament. They deemed that more important than the written law. Now, when the disciples didn't wash their hands in the feeding of the 5,000, that's what bothered in Matthew 15, 1 and 2. That's what the Pharisees were so angered about. Not for Jesus feeding the 5,000, but their disciples didn't wash their hands. That is not in the written law of God. That is in the oral law. The oral law. That's why I say Jesus could never win. He either violated the Old Testament written law or the oral law. And so according to this oral law, it was handed down to Moses. Moses handed the law down to the elders of his people, then to the judges, and on throughout the history of the Bible, stopping with the rabbis of Hillel and Shammai. After Hillel and Shammai, nobody received the oral law. All of these oral laws were simply sayings of the rabbis. And they were all compiled in a book called the Mishnah. The Mishnah. And so many times in my writings, I will have Mishnah and then the name of the book, and it's what the rabbis themselves said. Hillel believed that a man could divorce a woman for any reason. Shammai said only for adultery. All right? Hillel believed that it was right to heal a person or help a person in need on the Sabbath. Shammai said no way. So they diametrically opposed each other, and yet they were both right in the eyes of the Jews because no rabbi was wrong. So if Hillel said, "This is my right hand," guess what? That's my right hand. You don't question him. If Shammai says this is your left hand, they're both right. That's the dilemma the oral law put the Jews in. Number 2, he claimed to forgive sins. Number 3, he claimed to be equal with the Father. Number 4, he chased the money changers out of the temple. Number 5, he said he would destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. Did he not say that? Sure, he said that, but what did he mean? He's referring to his body as the temple of God. And number 6, his disciples ate with unwashed hands. Number 7, he claimed that God saved the Gentiles. These are the 7 reasons that are specifically pointed out in the New Testament, I never read these in any book. This is my own research. So if you have something to say differently, have at it. No, all right. 4 soldiers were detailed for each cross, all under a centurion. So here is the cross of the first thief, and he had 4 soldiers and a centurion ahead of him. Here is the cross of Jesus. He had 4 soldiers and a centurion ahead of him, and so forth, even with the third cross. The procession was headed by the centurion. The tradition says his name was Longinus. Then the one who proclaimed the nature of the crime. This was to elicit any testimony in favor of the criminal. This was a practice of both the Romans and the Jews. He carried a white wooden board called a titulus on which the crime was written. So here we have the procession of these 2 thieves and Jesus, and at the head of the procession is the centurion on a white horse, and behind him is the person carrying that white titulus with the crimes listed on it so everybody could see. C, the longest road to the place of execution was taken, and through the most crowded streets. This was the way it was with a wedding procession, by the way, okay? So as to attract the most public attention. It is called the Via Dolorosa, the road of sorrow, from Pilate's judgment hall to Golgotha. So the beginning of this procession was Pilate's praetorium, or his palace, and then went on down the Via Dolorosa. D, crucifixion was not a Jewish mode of punishment, although Maccabean King Janneus crucified not less than 800 persons in Jerusalem alone. I base that upon what Josephus says in Antiquities and Wars. The Jews put people to death in one of 4 ways: strangulation, burning, beheading, and stoning, but crucifixion was disallowed. There was only one instance in which the Jews could kill somebody without having Roman authority. And that is if somebody illegally went into the Holy of Holies. They could grab him and kill him on the spot. Even these 4 ways of killing, they had to have the approval of the procurator. E, crucifixion was employed by the Romans after the time of Caesar, but it was of Phoenician or Persian origin. F, 6 feet from the place of execution, the criminal was undressed, that is, only the covering absolutely necessary for decency being left, the loincloth. They were never totally naked. G, there were 4 kinds of crosses. There was the simplex cross, which is like a cross tie, called the crux simplex. 2, there was St. Andrew's cross in the form of the Greek capital letter key, the crux ducusita, the Latin or dagger cross, as you can see. There were 3 different kinds of those, called the crux immissa, and number 4, St. Anthony's cross, the tau cross, the crux commissa. Tau was the capital letter in the Greek alphabet, okay? And the X, we call X, is the capital key in the Greek alphabet. Let me point out that the swastika, now catch this, the swastika cross, it was a cross at one time, was the symbol for Buddhism and Hinduism and the symbol of good luck in the early 20th century prior to Nazi Germany adopting it in 1930. Did you ever know the swastika was a cross? It was. And Hitler took that cross and he made it into a very evil symbol. The place was called Golgotha, the skull, due to its shape. Last year, I asked a lady who went to Palestine, who saw this. I said, did this place look like a cross? And she said, yes. I mean, it looked like a skull. She said, yes. That's exactly. There are those who say it was named the place of the skull because skulls were found there. That's a misnomer. That's not true. Okay? There was a high, rounded, skull-like rocky plateau and a sudden depression or hollow beneath, as if the jaws of the skull had opened. The wrists were nailed, for they were considered part of the hands. The hands were never nailed, okay? Only the wrists. Why not the hands? That's right. The weight of the body would cause, that's right. You would just split all the way through your hand, but not the wrist. J, it was a merciful Jewish practice to give the sufferer strong drink, strong wine mixed with myrrh to deaden consciousness. This was at the cost of an association of wealthy women in Jerusalem. The Roman government did not do this. They didn't have that much mercy on these dying victims. They didn't care if they starved or died of thirst. But these women did. K, the titulus was affixed to the cross. On it was inscribed the charge of the crime. Before this, the board was carried in the procession. It was written in Latin. There's a glitch. I've corrected all these glitches in my main document. Written in Latin, Greek, and Aramean. Matthew 27:37 says, and set up over his head his accusation written, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Do you know all four gospel writers have something different? All four. But what is the common denominator? What is commonly seen in all four? Jesus, the King of the Jews. The translators are the ones who capitalize these other words, not the Holy Spirit. The Greek rarely ever capitalizes words in the New Testament. Bodies of criminals could not be left hanging overnight in Jewish culture, not even criminals. Deuteronomy 21:23 says, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day, for he that is hanged is accursed of God, that thy land be not defiled, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. M, sometimes there was added to the punishment of a crucifixion that of breaking the bones of the legs by means of a club or a hammer. Though it would not bring death, it was always followed by a sword or a lance or a stroke. And it was this lance or sword that ended what remained of life. Thus, the breaking of the bones was a sort of increase of punishment by way of compensation for its shortening by the final stroke that followed. Scholars believe that the cross on which Jesus was crucified was the Latin cross because they needed an extension in order to nail that board to. There are those who believe, and I've read this so many times in bulletin articles, back especially in the 70s and 80s, that Jesus died when the pericardium around the heart, I think that's what it's called, Stan, was punctured. He stuck that spear. No, Jesus was already dead when the lance went into him. Pardon me, Lance. All right. This is one of those fables that started and circulated throughout the brotherhood. I have a lot of these kinds of things. Scientists say on the long day of Joshua, that's another myth that has been proven to be wrong. Jesus died of suffering. That's what killed him. His life wasn't cut short because his pericardium was pierced. He died of sheer suffering. 8, archaeologists have discovered, this is very interesting. I've never come across this except this one source. Archaeologists have discovered Jewish victims of crucifixion. The skeletal remains show that the spikes were driven in the sides of the hills. So the legs were placed on the outside of the stipes, the upright part of the cross, and the heels were nailed right through the bones of the heels. So here we have the stipes. Jesus' feet weren't nailed like this. They were on the side, and they were nailed in here. So you take the soft part between that, what is it, a ligament or what? On the a tendon and the bone. And that's where these bodies, how these bodies were crucified. When a criminal was condemned to be crucified, you have to think about it. When you put your feet, a foot on top of the other foot, you have got to have a spike about that long. All right, these spikes weren't that long. When a criminal was condemned to be crucified, he was taken from the judgment hall, the praetorium, and set in the middle of a hollow square of 4 Roman soldiers. His cross, called the patibulum, or the transverse bar, notice that's the bar goes this way, the stipes already being set in the ground. Whenever the Romans crucified someone, they already had the upright piece of the cross in the ground. And so when they took these victims, they laid that transverse bar on the ground, laid the victim to it, and secured him to that. All right, the stipes already being set in the ground was then laid upon his shoulders. Then they uprighted him, and he had to carry that transverse bar. He was then marched to the place of crucifixion by the longest possible route. There was another reason for this. Whenever someone was condemned by the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin's purpose was for what one reason? Was it to condemn or to acquit? It was to acquit. Their job was to find that person innocent. Now remember, when I told you not long ago about the Eichmann Trial, Adolf Eichmann was one of the henchmen of Adolf Hitler and involved in the murders of these Jews and other minorities. His trial was held in Jerusalem, but they brought German lawyers to Jerusalem to argue for him, to argue in his favor. That's how right the Sanhedrin, the judicial system is of the Jews. So the Sanhedrin voted to condemn this man to death. And as they were, let's say they were going out there where Don is sitting, and there was a horse that was stationed between the Sanhedrin and the destination. Why was that horse stationed out there with a rider on it? What comes to your mind when you remember the Sanhedrin's trying to acquit this person? In case there's somebody who has information that has not been divulged to the Sanhedrin that would be in favor of that victim. That man on the horse would wave a flag. He would wave a flag. They would bring the victim back to the Sanhedrin and retry him in hopes that they can get him off. They didn't want to kill anybody except whom? Jesus. They weren't giving him all the benefits of their very reason for existing. They broke every law of theirs with respect to one man, Jesus. That's how prejudiced and cold-hearted and mean-spirited they were.
Jesus came and sort of done away with a lot of their livelihood.
That's right. Just like Paul, Demetrius in Ephesus, he put the whammy on the silversmith business. And when you hit a man's pocketbook, that's serious, very serious. All right. He was made to march by every road, street, lane, or alley, while before him there marched another soldier carrying a white placard. So wherever a road intersected, They took that road. And his crime was inscribed on it so that he might be a terrible warning to anyone, especially children, who were contemplating such a crime. Jesus began carrying his own cross. All right? Come on in. All right. We need that today with respect to these kids that take pistols to school. Thank you all.